For a lot of people, VO2 max is nothing more than a number on their watch that tells them that they're not really training hard enough. So let's see what it actually is, why we might care, especially as really long endurance athletes, and how we can improve it. Welcome or welcome back to Trail and Ultra Running Training. My name is Will France. I'm a running coach, strength coach, and I've helped athletes get stronger and improve their performance in distances ranging from 5Ks to 200 miles. The whole goal of this podcast is to help you train a little better so you can improve your performance and have more fun. If you like this information, I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe. I think that is currently still the most important metric according to the robots that run our lives. Or you could leave a rating or review or just share it with somebody. That'd be really appreciated. Anyway, first, before getting into the VO2 stuff, I want to say that I really appreciate you bearing with me every year as we go through the big fall race season. I always have a ton of people racing, and I travel to crew, and the schedule gets just sporadic. The release schedule specifically of this podcast gets a little more sporadic as I try to coach people towards goals and travel to go crew and provide emotional support. Because very honestly, as much as I love doing this podcast, it is not as important as the people who hire me to help them and the athletes I actually coach, right? So we often drop back to one episode a week or maybe miss a week here and there. This past weekend, I was in Phoenix, crewing an athlete, catching up with friends in Arizona. I went to school in Tucson, so it was nice to see some old friends. And then I spent the weekend mingling with runners at Javelina, which is one of the biggest trail races of the year. And it was really nice. It was lovely. I didn't sleep worth anything, but it was very fun. And it was also a really great weekend for Team Mountain Goat across the board. One of the Salt Lake runners had his first 50K. He's only been running 5K. That was very different. He's only been running a few months, and he almost broke the 25-minute mark. Another athlete ran the Tussey Mountain Back 50 miler and crossed the finish line in just over 10 hours, which is just fantastic. And Brianna ran a great race at Javelina, coming in just under 24:40. We were aiming for a 24-hour finish, but the 3-digit heat kind of threw a bit of a wrench in the gears for lap 2. She still ran great, and we seem to have finally nailed solidified, whatever you want to call it, some things that we've been trying to dial in for years, from food strategies to a problematic hip. She was on the podcast in episode 21, back when it was under a different name. And at the time, I was just helping her with nutrition, not doing her run programming, but she talked about the fact that she has an ostomy bag. So finally getting a nutrition strategy that works, and not only works, but provides a shitload of carbs on an hourly basis has been both a struggle, and the fact that we're finally there is amazing. And it did allow her to run incredibly well. She's recovering well, and she's planning to do another 100 this weekend. So this weekend we have 5 more people running, a couple in Antelope Island 50K. So I'm going to go hang out on the island with Teddy for the day, provide emotional support because crewing isn't allowed. If you are local and you see me at Antelope 50K or out on Antelope Island during the 50K, please say hi. I'm really bad at faces. I almost might have some face blindness, kind of bad at faces. So just yank me. I would love to meet you. I'm not doing anything other than waving at people and hanging out with my dog in a pretty place, right? So grab me if you see me, and then there'll also be a couple more people spread across the country. Anyway, that's probably enough gushing over the lovely people I have the privilege of coaching. It makes me very happy, but I'm sure it's probably fairly boring for anybody else. I just appreciate you sticking around and listening, even when the schedule or things might get a little more sporadic than I might like, right? So let's talk about VO2 work, because that was the whole point. VO2 max. VO2 max is, let's define first, probably helps to make sure that we know what it is. It is the maximum volume of oxygen that you can intake and process with your lungs. It is usually measured in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per minute. So if you are let's say your VO2 max reads as like a 40 or a 50, that means you are intaking 50 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per minute. We can also just see the absolute number, irrelevant to kilograms or irrelevant to body mass, but it's pretty useless in the grand scheme of things because VO2 max can be is largely useful as like some upper end barometer of like power to weight ratio. But even then, it is not perfect. There's a lot of issues with measurement. I think it seems to have become, and I get this from Steve Magnus's book and a bunch of other places, it seems to have become really popular to test VO2 max because of how easy it is in the grand scheme of things to test, right? Like it's a one-time measurement that you probably would only need to take like fairly infrequently as a professional athlete to get some data that might have been useful. We're going to get to why I said might have, but like that might have been useful. You strap a mask to your face and basically try to kill yourself on a treadmill until you pretty much fall off. And then you see how much oxygen you are intaking as you more or less fell off the treadmill. And we can use that to see like what that pace was at flat or incline or whatever, and what your heart rate might have been. And then we can maybe like set some zones or set some paces based on when we started to cross into that VO2 max space. Right? So that's what it is. That's what it tells you. Endurance athletes tend to be really high on this, but we'll get back to that as to why that may be. It might not be the training as much as it is like something else, right? So first though, let's continue to figure out why the measurement might not be great. Big one is the brain. The brain can really affect your performance on any test, right? Like we've all probably taken a test in school where we were kind of sleepy or unfocused or had something else going on or were kind of sick, and we did shittier because we just weren't fully there. And this is not just true of cognitive ability, this is also true of physical stuff, right? So they have played tricks on people where they've told them how long the test was going to be versus like a completely unnamed or like unfinished test, or they told them how long it was going to be and then they're like, surprise, here's some more time on the end. They have given them the test at different times of day. They've given them the test on back-to-back days, and they've seen statistically significant changes, or importantly significant changes in VO2 max, either up or down, depending on how they adjusted the test and how your brain felt and how recovered you were, etc. Right? It's not a ton. It's not like we're dropping from 80. I think the highest one ever recorded was 95. So it's not like we're dropping from this like high end of incredibly good endurance athlete to 40, but it's enough to where it might matter, and it might matter when like setting up pace stuff, right? So is there a VO2 max? Is there a single number? Yeah, probably, in the sense that there is an objective truth to many things. There is probably a number, or a maximum, almost certainly a maximum amount of oxygen that your lungs could take in and process on their best day. And we could call that your VO2 max. But you're probably not going to learn it from testing. And then even if you are, what are we going to do with that data, right? Probably not a lot, if I'm going to be super honest. We are probably not going to set pace stuff from it too much because we know now that it's a little less important. We're probably not going to set as many heart rate values off of it. That could be the most useful thing if you run by heart rate a lot, which can be a good way to get metrics. I'm starting to play with it a little more as a like double check on my systems, right? Like currently I'm a little under the weather, so my heart rate's elevated by quite a bit. So I'm just ignoring it and just trying to have fun on my runs. But we can use it if we're feeling pretty good from like week to week as a barometer for how we're doing. So it might help you set heart rate metrics. But what also helps you set heart rate metrics without getting on a treadmill with a like F-16 pilot's mask strapped to your face is a max heart rate test, where you just go to try to kill yourself on the treadmill or out on the track without having to pay a lot for a test that's not going to give you a lot of data, right? And then we use that in conjunction with your resting heart rate to figure out heart rate reserve, and then we can set some pretty solid heart rate targets. So I don't see a lot of purpose to the VO2 max stuff, or at least the number, right? I don't see a lot of purpose to the number because we're not going to use it for much. I don't believe that testing is worthwhile unless you're going to use it for something. Testing is not inherently worthwhile. Testing is worthwhile if it's going to change your course of action. I don't think a VO2 max would pretty much ever change my course of action with an athlete. So I don't care, is really my assessment there. And if we were going to get one, I would want it to come along with a bunch of like secondary and tertiary data that it often would, to be fair, that we would actually use as a like side effect of just running the test. Now, there's also this number on your watch that will often tell you VO2 max stuff. Mine's either too old or I haven't set the setting right, and I don't care because your watch doesn't know anything. I put out an email about this a while ago, or last week, I don't know, time has no meaning. And your watch is problematic for many reasons. It doesn't know this number. A lot of people get very obsessed and focused over it. So one thing that we could say is the number might, strong on the might, be relevant to itself, right? Like if you have been doing very similar training for a long time, many months, very consistently, and your training has run a pretty decent gamut of like heart rate and effort zones, then if your VO2 max goes up, it could, again, double underlined, bolded, be an indicator of changes in fitness. Now, all of those caveats are super important, and it's one of the reasons I don't give a shit. The number itself is absolutely not an accurate metric. One thing I will say, push pause on this, is that VO2 max is a decent indicator of like longevity and health and all-cause mortality. If you are like if you are above average for your age bracket, because it is very age related, you have a chance of living longer. It is very related to longevity. We could all get hit by a bus, right? So like it's not a perfect metric, but it's about as much as we have. And we'll get into reasons for why that is, but much like your grip strength is also a really good metric for this, and it's largely because it's tough to cheat grip strength. Yes, you could do a crush gripper all day long, but most of the time when people have a strong grip strength, it's because they've been active and used their hands a lot and picked up a lot of weight or done a lot of climbing or did things, right? Their hands have been active their whole life. Same thing when we see VO2 max, it is very likely an indicator of, it is almost always an indicator of long, consistent work and effort and training and just being active, which is probably the best indicator we have of health, is just being active for 30, 60 to 60 minutes a day across the board, right? So that's probably the best thing we can do for our health. VO2 max is a pretty good indicator of that, which we'll get to in a second, but like you can't cheat it. It just has to aggregate over time. So back to the watch. Garmin's, or whatever, I have a Garmin, I'm sure Coros works the same because they all kind of work the same, work on an algorithm, right? And if we're running really slow, what it basically does is compare your pace to your heart rate and like run an algorithm to see what your VO2 max might be based on a shitload of data. Now, if we have a heart rate if we have a heart rate and a pace that is on our upper end, if you do a lot of speed work, say you train for a 5K or a 1500 meter or something like that, then your watch will be more accurate, at least directionally, towards your VO2 max numbers because it will have more data that the data can't diverge as much as it gets closer to that. Whereas if you do a ton of low and slow running, be it either just that's kind of your jam, or if you're in like the last 6 week build to an ultra and really your speed work is pretty maintenance mode, I guess, for most people, then we're not going to have a lot of data. And especially in your taper, you are getting fitter because your body is recovering from all of the work you've done. But your watch is stupid and doesn't know that, so it just sees you not training and is going to tell you that you're detraining and you're unproductive and that you're going to die tomorrow, right? Like your watch doesn't know these things. It just uses a bunch of data and then makes a general assessment. And a lot of the time, they're trying to make general assessments for the average populace, and it doesn't necessarily apply to like high mileage athletes or like high intensity athletes. Now, another reason this doesn't necessarily match is because we can see an increase of VO2 max from multiple directions. So it's not just this like harder, faster running that your watch would say is like the only important thing that would indicate your VO2 max. You can also build it from a lot of volume, right? So we can do harder, faster running to build it, and we can build it from a lot of volume, and you will probably see the most improvement from both, some combination of the two, right? Like pretty much every coach on the planet is going to recommend a bunch of low and slow, easy running, and then fairly regular weekly or biweekly speed work, depending on your overall volume and recoverability, right? We also see this in mitochondrial development. Your mitochondrial development is big in the running world because it's kind of an indicator of aerobic fitness. It's hugely related to that, like with capillary density and all this stuff. And it also develops through two different pathways. We always hear about this like zone 2. You have to run slow to get your aerobic base up, and blah, blah, blah. And it's not that it's false. It's just that it's like, I don't know, let's not weight it. I would say half the story, but it's probably actually closer to 80% because you can make a ton of progress by just doing that. But it actually develops on two pathways, right? Like we have the AMPK pathway, then we have the calcium calmodulin pathway, and one of them, like the calcium calmodulin, I believe, like does more on the slow side. And then the AMPK is the faster side, right? So if we want to get the most out of our training for mitochondrial development and aerobic fitness, we would do both. And it's kind of true across the board because guess what? We're supposed to do both. So if you want to get the best training, do speed work. Now, what has the biggest effect on VO2 max? Genetics. If you want a higher VO2 max, the best thing you can do is choose different parents. By a long shot, not even close, right? Like the fact that high-level endurance athletes have an incredibly high VO2 max. We're talking like a lot of most of like cross-country skiers and professional cyclists and professional marathoners are all above like 70, 80, these kind of things that are unreal numbers for the rest of us. Like I've never tested mine. I'm sure it's not in the ballpark of that. If so, I would be faster. Now, the fact that this is true for a lot of endurance athletes is not so much a note on their training. It is more of a situation where the sport picks the athlete, right? Like a lot of the time, the people who are going to have a higher VO2 max are the fast kid in class, and they end up doubling down because we like to do stuff that we're good at, and then when we're good at it, we might get the scholarship and we keep running because it reinforces what we're good at, all this stuff, right? So it's more often the case that the VO2 max picked the sport and the sport didn't build the VO2 max. Yes, VO2 max is trainable. You will hear that across the board because it is, but it's tough to train, and a lot of the training mechanisms aren't, I don't know. Let me think about how to say that for a second. So like we should care as ultra runners. And this is a question I get a lot, right? Like, why do I give a shit about my top end VO2 max stuff? Why should I do speed work if I'm going to be running this race at a like zone 2 slow pace, right? Well, One, if VO2 max is low, it puts a ceiling on everything else, right? Like it is your top end. It's the most oxygen that you can absorb. Short of like neuromuscular, your legs can do the work space, it is the next highest limiter for what you can achieve. So if you have a really low VO2 max, then we're also putting a cap on your aerobic and lactate thresholds and these things that we're guaranteed to be using during the race, right? Velocity at VO2 max has been shown to be one of, if not the best, kind of depends on the study, but arguably the best indicator for performance in trail running of all distances. If you are faster at your if you're faster at VO2 max, you will do better, right? Now, if you notice, I didn't say VO2 max, right? Like we're not necessarily trying to build this actual intake capacity of oxygen. It might happen as a side effect, but very honestly, it just doesn't respond super well to targeted training. It does respond. When we study people, I didn't do anything. Scientists have studied people, researchers, and they have worked with professionals and like more elite athletes versus the rest of us, all the way to untrained populations. And typically, if the person is not doing a ton of VO2 max work and we put them through a VO2 max program, then we see pretty decent improvements for 4 to 6 weeks. And then we see a massive plateau. And further improvements, if any, come very slow and steady. So the actual amount of oxygen you're going to intake, unless you're kind of deconditioned, is like you might see an initial spike, which is great. It's your body kind of responding to this and like developing an adaptation system. Basically, you've embarrassed your body. It feels like shit to do this work. And it's like, well, I need to intake more oxygen now. But then further progress is going to be this like very logarithmic graph where it plateaus and just kind of continues to slowly move upwards. And eventually, it might actually start to move down, right? This is also what we see, except for the last part, this is also what we tend to see of aerobic systems, right? Like big plus initially, and then you're just not gonna skyrocket an improvement forever. Like you will plateau. This is part of training. Now, we also see athletes continue to improve their performance as their VO2 max drops, like all the time. It's incredibly normal in season, especially for marathon runners and like longer distance. I remember some story about Shalane Flanagan that I'm going to completely misrepresent, but basically her VO2 max dropped throughout a season and year over year, and yet she continued to kick ass year after year because it's not the be-all end-all metric that we sometimes treat it as, right? Further, older athletes will likely have a lower VO2 max because there is an age-related decline, right? Just like we're going to have some age-related decline in our eyesight, we're also going to have some and joints and structures and whatever. As we get older, our VO2 max is going to come down a little bit, right? So it doesn't mean we can't do great. We're seeing a lot of distance runners peaking in their mid to late 30s. The most recent winner of Hard Rock, I believe, was 49. So it doesn't matter what the all-out metric is and what your actual intake of oxygen is, as much as the work matters, right? Like when we talk about training VO2 max, we're not really training VO2 max as much as we are just getting faster and working at that top end to get faster, right? And I'm sure someone much more educated than me could give you an explanation on exactly what's happening here, but the short version is if you do these things, these workouts or this top end work that we might often see as, quote, VO2 max training, we're going to get faster and then we're going to run better. Right? So how do we do this after 20 some minutes of me rambling? How do we train this top end effectively, right? Now, first, I want to remind everyone that the large majority of your running should be slow. Now, if you're just getting started, if we're running less than 3 hours or maybe like 15 to 20 miles a week, then it probably doesn't matter all that much. Run in a way that you enjoy. Don't get super OCD about it. Honestly, if we're that low in the volume front, if we're in the like 10 to 15 to maybe 20 mile range, then it probably doesn't matter. As long as you feel good and you can recover and you're enjoying what you're doing, then just building up some of that volume in a way that you don't hate and isn't a slog fest where you're constantly looking at your watch and your heart rate is going to be the jam. And that's what we should do, right? So let's not stress this early in our running journeys. But once we get to training at like 30, 40, 50, 60 plus miles a week, then the vast majority of your running should be easy. And it can be hard to run easy if you're not used to it. So the one thing I will say is early in your running journey, maybe practice the skill of it at least once a week, twice, I don't know. But practice the skill of it. Practice different paces, explore, figure out how you can make different paces feel good. Maybe everything from like a really fast, hard couple minutes to where you're kind of burnt out to a pace that you could hold for hours, even if you aren't very good at running yet. And then learn to run at those different paces and make them feel similar. And that is going to help you down the line. Now, when we get into this larger running volume, what tends to work is what we might call pyramidal training. So the biggest chunk, like in a 3-tiered system, right? Or even a like slider scale. So the biggest chunk of your training should be low, slow, zone 2 or lower, maybe popping into low zone 3. But for the most part, easy, mostly conversational running. And if we do that, you're going to be able to aggregate a lot of volume without a ton of damage, and your recoverability is going to remain high. And then we should have a moderate level of lactate threshold work, and then like even less of this like VO2 max or top end work. If you're only running 3 to 4 times a week, then we might cycle these back and forth. Now, what do we mean when we say VO2 max work? Basically, spend time with your heart rate at 90% or above 90% of your maximum heart rate. And we should probably focus on one of these sessions every 7 to 14 days for some chunk of time, right? I'm going to call it VO2 work, even though we know it's not really building your VO2 max, because language is imperfect. And as long as we define terms, then we can use imperfect language to have useful conversations. So from here on out, VO2 work is going to be training that gets you above 90% of your max heart rate and improves velocity of VO2 max. Cool. So it can take 10 to 14 days to fully recover from a VO2 session, for your body to fully like integrate the adaptations that you're trying to put in. So we could do this every week, and then some people do these twice a week. I'm not good enough, nor do I have enough recoverability to really do that or make that worthwhile. So probably once a week. And then after a block of 3 to 6 weeks, maybe give it a longer rest, right? This would be more useful in a block training style, where we focus largely on VO2 max, and we might focus on lactate after that. We might focus on something else after that. Or we could do it like every other week, where 1 week we might focus on a VO2 max workout, and then the next week we might do like a targeted lactate workout, and then a little extra speedy, kind of steady stuff during our long runs. And that would work really well if you like to train on a 10 to 14 day training cycle, which I actually like a lot, but tends to be difficult to program, largely for scheduling reasons. But I still kind of do it for everyone. It's just a little sneakier. Or we could do a bit of a mix of the two, which is actually my favorite. Can do a block of this work farther out from the race, partially just to learn how to do it. You're going to have to build some abilities here, and then do tune-ups every 2 to 4 weeks as we get closer, right? Like we might spend a month to 6 weeks really building this top end, and then once every week or 2 or 3, we can tap it again, stimulate that top end, and maintain what we built, maybe build even a little further, and then definitely cut it 10 days out from your race to make sure that you can get the most out of your taper. this is often like one of my last or second to last speed sessions before a race is going to be some of this top end work, because really want to get this stimulus, partially because it can also drop off somewhat quickly. If you're active, it's not going to drop off a lot. It's not going to plummet, but it can be good to give it a bit of a kick in the ass right at the beginning or right before you start your taper. Now, how do we target the effort here? That's a good question, and you can use heart rate. I don't find it effective like at all. I think it's a waste of your time, and that's not what I recommend. It can take like 30 to 90 seconds for some people for heart rate to really elevate into this range. And then it's going to stay elevated almost entirely during your recovery interval, right? Because once it cranks up to 185, it might not plummet back down for a minute, depending on you and recoverability, et cetera, the things I've said 20 times already in the last half hour. So depending on you and your intervals, we might be on enough of a delay that the interval could be over or half over before we get your heart rate up. And then do we count the recovery as recovery, even if we're walking? The answer is yes, but like this is why it becomes shifty, right? So I like heart rate on these largely as a post-training check. If someone has a heart rate monitor attached for these, I find it super helpful, especially if we're learning to do these, because I can see if you're pushing hard, right? Like if I have some idea of what your max heart rate is, it doesn't need to be perfect, and then we're close to that, then you're in the zone. But it's not a great in the moment target. It's on too much of a delay. I prefer pace or effort. Pace would usually be somewhere between like a mile and a 5K pace, depending on your level of fitness and depending on the disparity between those two things. I would say for someone who runs a like sub 15 5K, then definitely a 5K pace. For someone who runs a 30-minute 5K, then we want probably a hard as fuck mile pace. And then any sliding scale in between, right? Now this would be on flat ground. I actually like to do these a lot on hills, either on the treadmill or out on the trails, but then it's going to be effort, not pace. So if you aren't sure what these efforts feel like, then maybe go to a track or turn the treadmill on or go run in a flat place in your neighborhood, and then we can figure out what it feels like to suffer at this level for a prescribed amount of time, and then we can try to hit that effort on the hills, right? Now, I don't like this on downhills because it's a lot of stress in your joints, and the cardio is going to be way harder to build because gravity is helping you. Now, I try not to get people, I just don't get too focused on the exact pace, right? Like for me, and for most people I coach, and I coach people way better than me even, there's just not a distinct and important difference between something like a 6:10 and a 6:20 pace, or like a 7:10 and a 7:20 pace, and then something like a 5:10 pace is often just unforeseeable outside of a sprint, right? Like you will see coaches, like professional track coaches, talk about doing intervals and swapping back and forth between like a 5:5 and a 5:20 pace, cycling back and forth between whatever. And for a lot of us, we're just not dialed in or good enough for that to matter. So aim for somewhere between a mile and a 5K. And like a hard mile or a hard 5K. You're racing this. You'd be racing that distance, but you're going to hold it for much less, right? Now, or, just run really fast without blowing up. It's not a sprint. You're not trying to be dead at the end of the interval, but you should be very happy to stop. If we think about a hard mile, it sucks from like 200 meters into it, and then you just kind of hold on for dear life for the next 7/8 of the run. Same kind of thing for a 5K. It sucks from like half a mile to a mile into it, and again, you just kind of hold on for dear life for the rest of the run. So it's not easy to hold these things for a few minutes, but it's also not like you have some left in the tank, right? So we can structure these in a bunch of ways. Remember that the basic target is that we're just trying to aggregate a good amount of volume at this high-end heart rate. So we could do a minute on, a minute off. The rest period is going to be short enough that your heart rate never really fully comes back down, especially if you kind of like jog the intermediaries here. If you stand around during that minute, then it might actually struggle, because remember, our heart rate's not really going to crank in a minute a lot of the time. But if we run the minute at like a mile to 5K pace, and then we run the minute rest at like an easy zone 2 pace, then we can keep the heart rate elevated and tap it pretty much every time. I also really like this structure for learning to do this work. But I'll get back to that in a minute, so I can kind of keep this structured. Another big one is 3 on, 3 off, like Jason Koop has this in his book. The Roches talk about this quite a bit, as they're like 5 by 3 minute hills. But 3 minutes hard, 3 minutes like easy. And by easy, I mean walking. Usually if I'm doing this workout, I will hit the 3 hard at a mile pace, and then I will walk for 2 minutes and then jog really easy for the last one, just so I'm not like tempted to take off from a sprint. So it's more of a smooth acceleration. Or we can get fancier. Do like various 400-meter repeats with 30 seconds of rest. Steve Magnus calls this, Steve and John on the On Coaching podcast, they talk about this as their 400-meter drill. And I really like this type of training a lot, where you do like a fast thing with a short recovery, but your heart rate never really fully comes back down. It kind of teaches your body to not only get faster at this high-end pace, but to recover quicker. But I would also say this is probably not where I would start if it's your first time doing it. Again, we can probably see or envision how all of those things would put you in that elevated heart rate zone for a while. Now, how much are we trying to collect? Probably in the 10 to 20 minutes of work range somewhere, right? It's not a lot, all said and done. In the grand scheme of your training, we're probably looking for 10% of your total training, maybe less. If you're running only 3 times a week for not very long, then it might be a larger percentage of that, but we're not looking for a lot. It is a tough day, and the training session should be longer, because we should probably do a 1 to 2 mile warm-up prior, and then some kind of cool down. Cool down doesn't matter as much. I know that's often blasphemy, but it just doesn't. Like, you can take a walk and do a little stretching and you're probably fine. It doesn't need to be this long cool down thing. But one note before this is we often have to learn to do this work. If you haven't run really hard in a while, you will probably have to spend a few sessions like teaching your brain that it's safe, that you're not going to die. Because these are the type of sessions where when you're pushing hard, your breathing turns to something like this. It is really difficult to keep it moving. You might only be able to say 1 to 2 words at a time. Definitely not speaking in full sentences. Definitely not having a conversation. You shouldn't, once you get used to it, once you feel safe, you shouldn't feel like you're going to die, but it should be pretty unpleasant, and your breathing should be incredibly elevated, right? So like, many times, I've programmed a fairly seasoned athlete who's been doing this for a long time, and we did like a 5 by 3 minute thing, kind of standard starting point for me, straight out of Koop's book and the USCA certification, and you can kind of tell they just ran it steady, because due to like sprint work or strides that we've already done, I've seen their heart rate get to like 185 or whatever, and then these intervals are done at like 160, which I just know is not the right number, right? So when we see that, we have a chat, and it's basically, it almost always goes along the lines of me saying like, hey, when was the last time you ran so hard that you felt like you were going to die and really struggled to breathe? And it's often years. So that is when we'll definitely start with like 8 to 10 1-minute repeats with a very explicit instruction of go so hard that you're not sure if you'll finish the minute. I would rather you go so hard that you have to slow down, and then you just get a longer rest period. Just go run too hard. And once we do that for 1 or 2 weeks, and again, it's not a sprint, but it's close to a sprint. Once we do that for 1 or 2 weeks, your brain just gets used to the idea that it's going to be okay, that we can do this work, and it's not going to die. It's not going to have an asthma attack, right? Like, I've struggled with this work in the past and probably mentally struggled with it longer than I needed to until I got an inhaler. And now, like, I don't really use it and don't really need it very often, but the fact that it sits there, it's in my pocket, means that I feel safer running it. Again, the brain plays a huge safety control mechanism when it comes to this work. And if we're not in a good spot with it, then we're probably not going to be able to push as hard as we can. So if you need to, take a week or two to teach yourself that this kind of work is really safe and do your programming and figure that out. And then we can start to program some sessions that will actually provide more of a stimulus, be it upping from 8 intervals to 15 with like a run recovery instead of a walk or hands on knees, or like 5x3s, right? Either way would be fine. But let's start by teaching ourselves that this is hard and that's okay. Now, as I said in the beginning, we make way too much of VO2 max. We can't necessarily train it very well directly. It will come up, but it largely is just one of these things that builds and aggregates over time. It's a huge limiter for races in the mile to like 5K range for most people. For these races, this type of work should probably be most of your direct speed work. If we see things like a lot of the 5K speed build might be 400 meter repeats at your 5K pace, and then 800s, and then miles, and we kind of string them together, right? And like that's why we're doing this, to get faster at your VO2 max at your upper end. But it doesn't mean it's a metric that matters all that much just because it's important. And if we do this training that would be considered VO2 max work, though, then we will get faster and we will run better and we will perform better, both because we have a bigger house under which we can put all of our aerobic work, and because we will have more of the muscular stuff that arguably probably matters more. Being faster is fun. Getting faster, not always so fun. But it's 10 to 20 total minutes of suffering per week. And it's not every week. And it's not every week of your training. So if you're open to it, it will help every aspect of your running, from speed to form to aerobic development to all this stuff. So figure out how to do this work, figure out how to do it well. If you have questions or want help with this, reach out. For a lot of people, now is a really good time, as I've kind of intimated. A lot of people are hitting some of their A races for the year. We might have a fairly longer break of 3 to 6 months, maybe even a year before you have your next one that really matters to you. So this far out is where we can really focus on this work. We can keep the overall volume much lower and hit the speed work a little harder, and that way we can get faster. So when we really have to go into this volume build in a couple months or longer, you will be able to do more. And you won't have to try to match these recoveries between running whatever high mileage week is for you, be that 40 to 80 to whatever, with all this speed work, and then trying to run a life, because I don't think any professional athletes run to this, right? So if you have questions, shoot me a message. You can DM me, you can respond to an email, if you have my phone number, please just text me. It's the easiest way for me to chat with you. And that's it. VO2 max is hard. It's great. It'll make you a better runner. And I hope you have a great day and go have some fun on the trails before they get completely covered in snow. Thank you again for listening to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Podcast. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Just a reminder, nothing you hear on this podcast is medical advice, and you should always speak with a medical professional before making changes to your training or your nutrition. If you enjoyed the podcast or found it helpful, please leave a rating or review. It tells the algorithm robots that people like it, and that means more people will hear it. Or even better, just share it with someone who you think would benefit. If you prefer a video version, head to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Group on Facebook, or check out the Mountain Goat Endurance Coaching YouTube channel. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great next run.